question of tonight's debate is the United States policy toward the Arab-Israeli conflict in the best interests of the United States? Mr. Bookbinder will state the affirmative, it is. Senator Abourezk will challenge that position. Mr. Bookbinder will take approximately 15 minutes to make his statement. The rebuttal will be of a similar length. Views will be exchanged for several more minutes. The floor will then be open to questions, and each gentleman will be allowed a 2 or 3 minute summary at the end of the session, which will end promptly by 7:20. I inject parenthetically a reminder that our two guests' book, Through Different Eyes, which has been reviewed very positively by some, less so by others, but the positives, I think, are winning. They approve, Mr. Bookbinder, remind me. The book will be autographed and for sale at the end of the session, just at the end. It's a pleasure to have these gentlemen. Mr. Bookbinder, whichever you prefer.
I'd like to see my audience. Muffled earlier. Do you hear me well now? Well, let me do my. See? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I have an idea that's a better mic. I'm going to go back. Right. Do you hear me now? Yeah. Is this better? Oh, that's good. We could use the rest anyway. Some people have started to dub this series of debates as the new Lincoln-Douglas debates. Not quite, but we just can't agree which is Lincoln and which is Douglas. As soon as we decide, we'll let that go. Let me start. I did it once. I think it's you don't hear me. Louder. All right, we'll try. There's a great story I heard recently, which helps me make the first point I want to make. It's a story of the American journalist who went to Moscow to do some man-in-the-street interviews. And he met the first man on the street, and he said, sir, doing some interviews, what do you think about Gorbachev? He says, well, I just read in TASS that Bavarian, what do you think about that horrible Chernobyl thing? He says, well, the problem tells me that, yes, a third question, same kind of answer. No, he says, I'm interested in your personal views. Don't you have personal views on these subjects? He said, yes, I do. But I want you to know that I am in total disagreement with my personal views. So I want to say that tonight, even though with pride, I note the fact that I've served the American Jewish Committee for 20 years. I am a fan of Israel. I am a fan of American policy in the Middle East. That is, the Arab-Israeli dispute is our part of the Middle East that we're talking about. But I have disagreements. I have personal views with my own Jewish community from time to time, with Israel, with the United States. And I've noted those differences in the book. I will note them as we go along this evening. I am a man of patience. So therefore, even though we've done this about 18 times, and I've read the book 3 times, I keep waiting for my colleague here to express some personal views, in the sense that it'd be of interest to me to know, sooner or later, I may hear it, that in all of these years, up to this point, it's my impression that he has never found anything of any consequence that is attached to the judgment of the Arab world with which he disagrees. Now, if it's so, if he totally agrees, then that's why we don't hear his personal views, and the other personal views. But I can't believe that that's so. I make this point because since this debate is based upon the book, my hope in the book was that even though I knew that our views were different on all of the essential points, because we're all friends and old enemies, even before the book, I thought that as a result of the book, we would both be reaching out to one another and saying, okay, I concede, ABC. I tried to do that. I acknowledge mistakes that Israel has made where I differed with the Jewish community, but we haven't had that. As a result of that, I think what we're getting out of the debate, and tonight also, will be not so much to indicate that there should be really some great hope for peace, because you see that Abourezk and Bookbinder show that there's a real potential for peace. That would be the most useful thing coming out of the debate. The less useful, but still useful thing, is to remind all of us that it's a very difficult thing we're looking forward to. Finally resolving this difficult, bitter dispute of many years. So let's go to work on the substance. In the book and in my general presentations, there are four basic themes, four basic aspects of my presentation that I want to quickly sum up for you now. Number one, that Israel's legitimacy as a state is justified by its history, its achievements, and its sacrifices, as it was compelled to fight and to win military victories over those who have sought to deny its legitimacy and to destroy it. It has been in America's own interest, I contend, and we'll come back to that, I hope, over and over again, what is America's interest? It has been in America's own interest to affirm its solidarity with and support of this type of state, the only state in the Middle East that truly shares and observes the kind of democracy and pluralism for which our own country stands. The second theme is that this special relationship, as it's come to be known, between the United States and Israel, has not prevented the United States from working also with Arab nations and seeking out those Arab nations with moderation and flexibility who share our general hopes for stability and peace in that area. Neither Israel nor American supporters of Israel have any objection to this, because Arab friendship is indeed needed for progress, and America's ability to have achieved something like the Camp David is the best evidence that America's Middle East approach is right. Friendship with and support for Israel, and reaching out to Arab nations who continue to want to be with us, even though we have disagreements on some important issues. They want to buy our arms, they want our alliance, they want our friendship, and that's right. And if there's anything that dismays me more than anything else in the record of my opponent, it's that at that time, and ever since, including today, he bashes Camp David, ridicules it and demeans it, and says it has not been a good step. And I know that before we're through, we will be talking more about it. Camp David, which brought peace to the largest single Arab nation, 50 million Arabs and Israel, which opened up the possibilities, tragically never realized, but opened up the possibilities for the greatest degree of freedom and liberation for Palestinians on the West Bank and in Gaza, called autonomy, never realized because it was opposed by the Arab world, including Arab Americans like Mr. Abourezk. So that's a tragedy. But our policy was to seek this kind of Arab and Israeli cooperation. Third is the theme that America's own self-interest, not what we're doing for Egypt and for Israel and everybody else, but our own immediate self-interest, has been well served by our Middle East policies in that part of the world. The close relationship between Israel and the United States has been increasingly impressive in its strategic value to the United States itself. Vital intelligence data is freely shared, especially the very crucial information that the United States obtained from the tanks and planes that Israel obtained during wars and turned over to the United States. It is a record that includes joint U.S.-Israel exercises with the Sixth Fleet, access to Israeli ports, Israeli facilities for storage and maintenance of United States material. The United States and Israel jointly involved in military training exchanges, the use of sophisticated Israeli hospital facilities, and so on. And in the United States, in the United Nations, and in international affairs generally, no country has the same record of support for American objectives as does Israel provide. Now, in its generous financial support, very generous financial support that America provides for Israel, it isn't only contributing a piece of charity to a charity case. by permitting Israel to be stronger, and militarily stronger especially, it is serving America's own interest to have this kind of ally in that area, and as we'll hope to have a chance to say, it is at bargain basement rates compared to the much substantially greater amounts we make available for our allies in Europe through NATO and so on. And fourth, the theme that flows from all of this is that the overwhelming majority of the American people for years and years and years have supported these Middle East commitments. It is a support that is reflected in the statements and the actions of every president and every Congress since the Balfour Declaration and especially of 1917, and especially since the State of Israel was formally established in 1948. Now, overwhelmed by this indisputable record of overwhelming American support, my colleague has only one answer. America has been this supportive of Israel because people like Bookbinder, the Jewish lobby, the Israel lobby, has simply had unlimited pots of political slush funds and has thrown it at every president and every senator and every news columnist and every educator. That's why America is pro-Israel. Not the slightest willingness to acknowledge that Americans have a natural affinity for a country like Israel, that America appreciates the democracy of that country, its courage, that America can feel something for a country like that as against a country and a world, a part of the world that has not prevented, if it hasn't caused, it has not prevented the ugliest type of senseless violence, terrorism. Instead, we get a response that that terrorism is just like any other kind of terrorism, any other kind of war. So, the answer then is, America has been pro-Israel because it has been bamboozled against its own interests. Now, I've already done, and I'm almost finished, I've already done what both Jim and I thought we ought not to do, which is to dwell so much on history, to talk about what happened. We should look ahead. I have only a few minutes left to look ahead, but you cannot look ahead and suggest solutions to the present problems without understanding how the present problems flow from that history. Because the most obvious, critical, single, underlying, and overlapping issue of all is that, in the opinion of the Arab world, with the great exception of Sadat in Egypt, and in the opinion of Mr. Abourezk's half of this book, Israel was never legitimate and isn't legitimate today. Israel never had a right to be created. It came in. There were no Jews there. In effect, he's saying that the Jews decided they don't want to live in Miami anymore, or Baltimore, or Kansas. He said, that's a nice spot of the world. Let's go in and take the state away from the Palestinians and make a Jewish state out of it. That's only a slight corruption of Mr. Abourezk's position. And not only that, but they don't deserve to be recognized today as a state because they're acting illegitimately, and you'll hear about that, rest assured. Well, I say that if we want to look ahead, we've got to hope and pray that others will do what Mr. Sadat did. He paid for his life for doing it, with his life. And that's a tragedy. So it helps us understand why others are not doing it. Well, we don't have to approve of that. That to say the simple words that Sadat said in the Knesset to the Israeli people, okay, the time has come for me to say there is room in the Middle East for a Jewish state. And if that won't happen, we won't make progress. I think it is possible to make progress. I'm not very optimistic, but last week's meeting of the Arab League in Amman adds a little bit to my hope and my confidence. Just a little bit. For one thing, because of the pressure of other things, what the Arabs were saying last week was, hey, maybe Israel isn't our greatest enemy. Maybe Zionism is not the real threat to us in the Arab world. The real threat is that crazy kind of militant fundamentalism. They said that in effect. And they even said that they're not so sure they want to deal with Arafat and PLO. Now, there is a possibility for a breakthrough. What is the possibility for a breakthrough? A possibility, because there are too many people opposed to it, including the present Prime Minister of Israel. There's at first a very important illustration of how I'm willing to state important disagreements. The present Prime Minister, it's a divided government as you know, says no to an international conference. I say that if in the judgment of people like George Shultz in our American government, and Avi Eban, and Peres, and other observers, if in order to get discussions with Jordan and with Palestinians to resume the peace process and move forward and try to get a breakthrough, in order to do that, you do need some kind of a cover, an international conference, or one called by the Soviet Union and the United States, which is what George Shultz tried to do a couple of weeks ago. I say, let's try it. Let's try it. The big stumbling block there is not only that there are opponents of doing that, but the big problem, and I'll close on this, I know it's a big problem, we will talk about it, is that there is very serious disagreements as to what Palestinians can and would be allowed to participate, at least at the beginning, in such a conference. And there the whole question of PLO, the legitimacy of PLO, the wisdom or lack of wisdom of sitting down with the PLO today, and I take the position that I support the American position on that. The American position is that if the PLO says two simple, eminently fair things. It's 1987, it's about time we heard them. The American position, endorsed by the last three presidents, is that a PLO says, okay, we do recognize the existence of Israel, its right to exist, but we're going to bargain hard with them for our rights. And if it says, in effect, we'll stop bombing food stores and school buses and airports, that then America says, we'll sit down and talk with you. And I believe that then Israel ought to say also, in that case, we will not talk to you. That can be a breakthrough for peace. But if we don't get that breakthrough, PLO saying that, then we've got to hope for a formula that doesn't include PLO, but which nevertheless makes possible some kind of forward progress. Thank you very much.
I'm going to try this microphone. If it doesn't work, I'll go back and sit down. How is it? Can you hear in the back?
Yes.
No? Is it the same? Is it hooked up to the same speakers or just a bad mic? What? It's okay? All right. First of all, I want to apologize in advance for I've had in the last several weeks a throat infection and a very serious cough, so I'm going to have to interrupt myself to cough every so often. It's a cough I can't shake. Ordinarily, if I were on a speaking tour, I would cancel out because I've been very sick for the last several weeks. But you heard what Mr. Bookbinder said about me to my face. What would he say behind my back if I were gone?
You know, I did try to get you to a Jewish doctor to take care of your health.
And he also tried to get me to eat some chicken soup, but he knows I'm a vegetarian. Well, that's the first time I've heard Bookie tell that story about I get in total disagreement with my own views, because I thought he was going to say that he was in disagreement with his own views when he started out. What he did was he told the story as I heard it to try to make the point that he's reasonable and I'm doctrinaire. And basically he's unable to argue this case on the merits. So that's why he spent the first 7 minutes, I timed him, the first 7 minutes attacking me rather than the issue itself. And I don't blame him. I think if I had a case like his to defend, I'd do the same. I would attack me personally. And the problem with that is, though, I'm so vulnerable that I can't respond because I'm totally imperfect as compared to Bookie, and I'm unable to respond adequately. So I'll just have to argue on the merits of the case. Now, what you hear from my colleague and friend, Mr. Bookbinder, is that Israel is a benign country that settled in the Middle East, and that they can't understand, and he can't understand, why the people around whom it settled were angry. He can't understand why they commit murderous acts of terrorism. I think that's how he usually states it, murderous acts of terrorism. And to hear him talk, Israel has never committed one act of terrorism itself. Well, let's be very honest in this whole matter. Let me say that Palestinians, beginning, I guess, back in 1964, began moving across the border from Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and committing acts of terrorism inside what is called present-day Israel. And let me say that on the Achille Lauro, the PLO, or the Palestinians who were on that, I don't know if they were actually part of the PLO or not, but let's call them PLO. They committed an act of terrorism by murdering Leon Klinghoffer. And the Abu Nidal terrorists who massacred the Jews in Istanbul in the synagogue committed terrible acts of terrorism. And the Israeli government issued a white paper 2 years ago in which they said, about a year and a half ago actually, excuse me, now comes my first cough of the evening. They issued a white paper, the Foreign Ministry of Israel, in which it said since 1969, when Yasser Arafat became chairman of the PLO has committed some 8,000 acts of terrorism, according to their count, and have killed 650 Israelis. Now let me just say that may or may not be a high figure, but let's accept it as an accurate figure. Now I can document, and anybody who looks objectively at the facts can document, some 25,000 innocent Lebanese and Palestinian civilians who've been killed by Israeli terrorism. So virtually no day goes by but what the Israeli Air Force does not fly over Lebanon and bomb a Palestinian refugee camp. And for years they bombed villages in the south of Lebanon. And then in 1981, 1978, 1982, they bombed apartment houses in Beirut, in the civilian center of the city, teeming with civilians, with phosphorus bombs. Phosphorus is a chemical that when it explodes on the human skin, it burns inward, and there's no way to stop the burning until it's finished, until it burns itself out. And cluster bombs, which have little tiny pellets of shrapnel, which sometimes do not explode when they hit the ground, these little pellets. And in Beirut, during the 1982 invasion of Lebanon by Israel, little kids thought they were toys, and they'd go pick them up and they'd explode in their hands. And if that's not terrorism, I don't know what it is. First of all, I want to put this issue of terrorism to rest. Both sides have committed terrorism. And I'd have to say Israel has committed much more terrorism because they have a better military strike force than the Palestinians do. But let's just put it to rest. Let's say both have committed terrorism. And now as to why the Palestinians are angry, as to why they should commit acts of terrorism, I don't justify it. I personally am a pacifist. I don't justify the terrorism. I don't like it at all. But let's ask ourselves why they began committing acts of terrorism. First of all, they learned the lesson from the Irgun and the Stern Gang, which were Jewish terrorist groups operating in the 40s. Secondly, they thought they picked up a bad habit from those groups. They thought, well, they grabbed the state by the use of terror, why can't we? And I think it's a bad decision on their part. I support very fully the nonviolent resistance movement that tried to establish itself inside the occupied territories recently, established by an American, a Palestinian American named Mubarak Awad, who has tried to lead a nonviolent movement. He's talked a number of Palestinians into getting rid of the stones and any weapons they might have. And he's taught them to go plant trees to prevent the Israeli occupation authorities from confiscating the land of the Palestinian farmers in the occupied territories. And yet he's been arrested a number of times. It's a Mohandas Gandhi type movement. He's been arrested arrested a number of times, and recently, about a month ago, he was told by the Israeli government that they were going to pull his papers and he could no longer come to the West Bank. So much for nonviolence and non-terrorism. In fact, I've been of the opinion that the Israeli government would rather have the Palestinians committing acts of terrorism, because their superior public relations skills enable them to get much more support from the United States as a result of terrorism, much more so than a non-violent movement like that of Abourezk Awaz. Now, Mr. Bookbinder has talked in part, after he finished attacking me, then he talked about not what was really good for the United States, not what was in the interest of the United States so much, but what was good for Israel. Now, I don't see anything wrong with supporting Israel. I want you to know that. I have no objection to the United States supporting Israel. But what I do object to very strenuously is the United States supporting financially, militarily, and politically the objectives of Israel. The objectives being to acquire territory from their surrounding neighbors in the Arab countries, which they have done very efficiently, and what the objectives are to hang on to the territory. In fact, the objectives of the Israeli government at this time are to eventually annex the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. There have been Israeli leaders who have made statements publicly to that effect. They've already annexed the Golan Heights. They already occupy a 6-mile zone in the south of Lebanon. And they occupy, of course, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And they intend to keep that. So what I think is in America's interest, not necessarily Israel's interest, but America's interest, is to put an end to the conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis. Basically, the United States is paying for that conflict. The American taxpayer sends a minimum of $6 billion a year to Israel and to Egypt. $3 billion this year, $3 billion this year to Israel, and $2.5 billion to Egypt, plus whatever interest we have to pay because we pay the money up front and we have to borrow it, and plus whatever tax-deductible contributions go from Americans to Israel in charitable contributions. We pay $2.5 billion to Egypt, which is nothing more than a bribe to keep Egypt from attacking Israel. Because the minute that peace treaty would end, of course, the $2.5 billion to Egypt would end. So you may as well add that on to the Israeli aid bill. And we here in America are paying for that conflict to continue. And I say it's in America's interest to stop the conflict as soon as possible. Now, unfortunately, our Secretary of State and our administration under Ronald Reagan are not doing anything to end the conflict. Let me tell you what they're doing. They are working hand in glove with the Labor Party, the Perez faction of the Israeli government, to try to get an international conference going, maybe with the Soviet Union, with the United States. Sometimes it's spoken of as being a conference with the Security Council members of the United Nations. Sometimes it's just the Soviet Union and the United States and Israel. And then they say, and you have to listen to this very carefully, then they say appropriate Palestinians. Now what they don't say, what they leave out, is the most critical part of this whole thing. They don't say the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is the chosen representative of the Palestinians. They're trying, with George Shultz's cooperation, Israel is trying to deal around the PLO. And they use all kinds of rhetoric and excuses to do this. They say the PLO is a terrorist organization. Number two, they absolutely deny the fact that the PLO is the government in exile for the Palestinian diaspora and the Palestinians under occupation. And they say the PLO wants to destroy Israel, therefore they can't sit down and talk to Israel. Israel can't sit down and talk to them. And they have all other obstacles. Now, if, Mr. Bookbinder said, if the PLO would just stand up and say one simple thing, we recognize Israel's right to exist. Well, he says he hopes Israel might follow up on that. Of course, there's no guarantee if they ever said that. But what's wrong with Israel at the same time saying, we recognize the right of a Palestinian state. And then we demand that the Palestinians give us simultaneous recognition. Is there anything wrong with that? Of course not. But that's not what they're saying. They're saying something totally different. And they expect, and they slide over it so quickly. You heard Bookie slide over it, and so does Schultz, and so does the Israeli government. They slide over it so quickly that you don't really stop to think about it unless you're a student of this area. But it's very critical to the Palestinians themselves. They've been suckered before. They were suckered by Sadat when he went into the Camp David agreement, who said loudly, and I congratulated Sadat when he went to Jerusalem. I sent him a telegram of congratulations. He went into that meeting at Camp David with the intention of coming out of there with something for the Palestinians. What he came out with was something for himself, and he forgot all about the Palestinians. And of course, the Palestinians, hopefully recognizing what was in their best interest, rejected what came out of Camp David because they saw what would happen to them. And in fact, they were right. They were absolutely right. Because the minute the treaty was signed, Menachem Begin said, we're going to start building settlements in the West Bank again, illegal settlements. And the Camp David Agreement set up an administrative council. Excuse me. It set up an administrative council. They saw through this as well. An administrative council made up of Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and any other Arab country that might want to join, and the Palestinians. And the big problem with that administrative council was that it was to exist for 5 years, after which it would expire, and then they'd have to renegotiate again. That it had to have a unanimous decision on any point. And I asked Jimmy Carter and Cyrus Vance when they briefed me, when they briefed the members of Congress who were interested in this thing. I said, what would happen if somebody on that council made a motion or offered a resolution to create an independent Palestinian state in the occupied territories? Cy Vance said, while Jimmy Carter was listening, Israel would most likely veto it, and we would agree because we're opposed to a Palestinian state as well. So there you have it. The much ballyhooed Camp David Agreement did nothing more than to slice off Egypt as a member of the Arab negotiating bloc. It neutralized Egypt. It permitted Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon to move into Lebanon in 1982. And for those who say that, wonderful, now Egypt is at peace, have totally forgotten the 18,000 Lebanese and Palestinians who were slaughtered in the 1982 invasion of Lebanon by Israel, including the hundreds and perhaps thousands, nobody knows, at Sabra and Shatila, who were massacred up against the wall and sitting in their houses. Massacred by right-wing Falangist Lebanese who were dispatched into the camps by the Israeli military in 1982. So it's small wonder that the Palestinians themselves are angry. They've been betrayed by the world powers, and they've been bullied by Israel. But now we've got a chance, we really do have a chance for a breakthrough. And if we are very careful in how we examine this, Arafat said a month ago, now he's brought along this revolutionary movement of his from a movement of armed struggle, which is how they started in 64 and then again in 69. He's brought them along until now they are ready for a diplomatic solution. Starting in 1972, as a matter of fact, the Palestine National Council began offering amendments to the Palestine Charter, which said, basically, we will accept any land that is already liberated. That was a total dramatic change in their position. And Arafat has now brought the movement along to such a point where a month ago he said, I am ready to sit down with Israel in the context of an international conference and negotiate a peace treaty. And yet George Shultz and Perez, Shamir won't even go that far. He's not progressed in the last 45 years. But George Shultz and Perez are now trying to deal around the PLO. They're trying to say, okay, let's talk to Jordan, and they want to select the Palestinian negotiators. And as one gentleman up in New York, when we were debating there, asked Mr. Bookbinder, he said, if you don't include the PLO, how long-lasting would any peace agreement be that you made with the appropriate Palestinians? Of course, there's no real answer to that question, at least from Mr. Bookbinder's point of view. But the answer is real. The peace agreement would not last very long at all. It would fall apart and you'd have trouble all over again. So let's be done with this stuff. You talk to me first, you recognize me, and then I'll talk to you. Let's do it either simultaneously or let's just sit down and talk. That seems to me the thing that makes the most sense. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll just run through several of the major points that require some brief comments if we want to get to you. First, I think again I heard a very disappointing confusion between terrorism and war. War is horrible. War is the ultimate atrocity. In war and conditions of war, all kinds of things happen, including what happens in the West Bank today. Self-defense can be justified, but it still ends up with casualties and people dying. But to confuse what the reasonable part of the world has come to understand by the word terrorism with other acts of war is just not very useful if we're going to try to find an answer. Now that confusion in language, which becomes very, very serious when you try to solve a problem, is reflected perhaps most poignantly and tragically in one sentence written by Mr. Abourezk in the book. Let me read that single sentence to you. The horrors of the Holocaust should not justify committing similar crimes against the Palestinians.
Would you mind reading the whole paragraph, by the way?
Yeah.
Don't you think that'd be more fair?
Well, nobody cares. You can take it on your time. He talks about the madness of Hitler's extermination of approximately, it only makes it worse, Jim, of 6 million Jews, extermination of 6 million Jews, and then says, he salutes that piece of history, but then he says, read
it, Bookie, don't interpret it, read it.
All right, but it's important to know it was not the Palestinians who committed a horrible crime. I've said that myself over and over again. They should not be made to pay. I've said the same thing. I don't know why they changed it. The important thing is what the point I'm trying to make, not the one you're trying to make. The point I'm trying to make now is that there is this unfortunate misunderstanding of what the Holocaust was, what it means, and how to deal with it sensitively. To say that the incidents we read about too frequently, in my judgment, of incidents on the West Bank against the Palestinians is a Holocaust, period. There's nothing more I need to say about that. Let me go to the next point, because we do want to try to look forward. PLO. The issue really isn't as simple as whether the United States or Israel should talk to the PLO. One can make philosophically, conceptually, I don't disagree with the idea that one talks to one's enemies. It's better to talk than to fight. But the sitting down with the PLO today is more than talking. It's an important political statement and a political decision that Israel will have to make to do that. That decision it does not want to make today, because again, I won't look for the page of the book. The fact is that despite these amendments that Jim talks about made by the PLO, some language about will settle to start with the occupied areas, the basic part of the PLO commitment has not been modified. The Charter says explicitly that it is our duty to eliminate, to exterminate the Zionist presence in Palestine. And as recently as 2 or 3 months ago, it was reaffirmed by top PLO leaders. So therefore, when George Shultz, the American government, says, in order for the process to move forward, there's some things you've got to do, or there will be understandable reluctance, refusal on the part of the Israelis to sit down with you. Now, if you want the Israelis to sit down, as I fervently do, then I say, if the PLO isn't prepared to do it and thereby become a party, let's try to do something different, but try to move it forward. 3-4 weeks ago, George Shultz, who apparently is now your least favorite cabinet member, it's quite clear, Jim, George Shultz was in Israel, was in the Middle East. He thought he had an appointment with 5 rather important, not top-notch, but rather important West Bank pro-PLO Palestinians. They've made statements, they were pro-PLO, but they're not representing the deep PLO as such. George Shultz, he thought he had, as a result of his people's negotiations, had an appointment to sit down with them and listen to them, get their views, what should be the next step. Here was an opportunity for these pro-PLO Palestinians to make their case. They weren't being appointed as negotiators. A few hours before the scheduled meeting, they got orders from Arafat. You must not sit down with George Shultz. Now, is that a constructive thing? I really did think that on this minor thing, I could get my friend to say, you're right, that was a stupid thing for them to do. No, he justifies it. He justifies it. So how can we move on? One final thing, the Carter anecdote. I have a Carter anecdote that goes right with it. I too was briefed in another group. I wasn't a congressman, I was a representative of a Jewish organization, and we also had a briefing. The same question came up. How did you come to that autonomy thing? Why was that the limit of your interest for the Palestinians? And the answer was from Mr. Carter directly, and he later related it in his book. He then put it in the book for everybody to read. He said that issue was raised. There was resistance by the Israelis, but we were considering it. We went to all the Arab nations we could and said, is this an important objective? And he said, and he must have said it to you too, Jim, not a single Arab country, including Egypt was involved, not a single Arab country said that an independent Palestinian state is one of their immediate objectives. And that's why it wasn't done. And so they developed another program of autonomy. And it was just simply irrelevant. The question asked by Jim Abourezk was irrelevant. The autonomy, the Camp David Accords described what the first 5 years would be. The first 5 years would be autonomy, would not be an independent Palestinian state. That issue was to come up after a 5-year period of autonomy. That was the nature of the Camp David Accord. So the question is asked, what if they then introduced a motion for autonomy, for independence? It would have to be rejected. So I don't know what we get out of that. Jim?
You get out of it just what you put into it. It's like a sewer.
No, I thought I was turning over the mic to you.
You are? Oh, you are?
Yeah, okay.
Actually, Mr. Bookbinder makes my point when he says the PLO charter has ominous, threatening sound. Of course, Israel is the first military power in the Middle East, the most strongest, the most powerful military force in the Middle East. The PLO is the weakest. And when he thinks that, when he says that Israel is threatened by the PLO, of course, the only people who believe that are the ones who want to believe it. It's not true. They aren't threatened by the PLO. And it makes my point when I say they ought to sit down with the PLO because the PLO is their enemy. That's who they're fighting with. You don't sit down with the American Jewish Committee if you're Israel. Wouldn't do you much good, would it? Or with the Council on Foreign Relations in Baltimore. You're not at war with Israel. But they have to sit down with those with whom they're fighting. And that's what they don't want to do, because if they do, they would have to give up the occupied territories eventually, ultimately, for a Palestinian state. And that's what they don't want to do. So that's why they have all these obstacles in the way. Now, George Shultz anecdote about being rejected by 5 Palestinians. First of all, Bookie often describes them as important Palestinians. And did you say supporters of the PLO? Pro-PLO. George Shultz can talk to the PLO anytime he wants to. He doesn't have to go and pick 5 people of his own to talk to. He can ring up Yasser Arafat or any number of PLO diplomats and talk to them anytime he feels like it. There's one up at the UN in New York. If he wants to talk to somebody, he can talk to him. Or he can send one of his undersecretaries to talk to him. And they do. But what is happening here is upon the demand of Israel back in 1975, Henry Kissinger said, no, the United States will not talk to the PLO unless they fulfill Israel's conditions, that is, recognition, renunciation of terrorism. Not Israel, but the United States will not talk to the PLO until they do these things for Israel. The other thing that you ought to know, besides the fact that George Shultz is trying to select Palestinian negotiators rather than letting the PLO select them, is that PLO diplomats are prevented from speaking publicly in the United States. Well, let me just see a show. How many people here knew that? One, two, about 5 people knew that PLO diplomats are prevented from making public statements in the United States. The reason I know that is that I once invited one of their diplomats when I was in the Senate down to Washington to have lunch with a group of congressmen and senators. His name is Shafiq al-Hout. He's a PLO diplomat who comes to the UN every year in New York. And I called the State Department. I said, well, I want to invite Shafiq down. He tells me that he needs a special visa. They said, yes, he does. We will give it to you. We don't want to argue with you because you're a U.S. Senator. But we'll give him the visa, but he cannot make any public statements. I said, well, I guess that that's the only condition. So we brought him down. We had lunch with 12 or 13 U.S. senators. Somebody in that room called up the Washington Post, and the Israeli lobby went wild. They absolutely went wild. Because Abe Ribicoff, who came to the meeting, is a Jewish senator, as you know, from Connecticut at that time, came to the meeting and sat there and listened, never said a word, just listened to Shafiq talk, then left after about 15 minutes and didn't come back. It was called, the Israeli press said that he sat down and talked with a murderer. So Abe never really recovered from that at all. But it's a violation, I think, of the First Amendment in this country, at the insistence of the Israeli lobby, that people who want to express the other side of the story are prevented from doing so. And I'll talk in a minute when I get my voice back about closing the PLO office in Washington.
Just to make one addition. Both of us, I think, are getting bogged down with anecdotes and that type of thing. Let me try to draw both of our attentions to what is the central issue in my judgment on the Palestinians. My contention is, and I believe that history will support my contention, that we would not even be having to talk about how to proceed now if at several critical moments in history the Arab world had not interfered with the creation of a Palestinian state. Starting way back in 1917, Balfour Declaration, vague as it was, ambiguous as it was, contradictory as it was in a way, nevertheless talked about a Jewish homeland and protecting Palestinian rights. 1947, the partition plan, that was really the critical moment in history. That's when a judgment had developed on the part of a lot of forces, including the UN. The UN didn't create Israel, but the UN, in a sense, was giving its blessing to what was inevitable, and by a large vote said there should be partition in order that a Jewish state shall be recognized and a Palestinian state. But the Arab world said no to that. And you know how viciously they said no? That in 48, a year later, when Israel declared its independence, based upon that partition plan, within hours after the declaration, 5 Arab armies, which had been poised for weeks, invaded the fledgling state in order to destroy it. And so there was no Palestinian state created then. Then for 19 years, the West Bank was controlled not by Israel, but by an Arab country, Jordan, that already had a lot of Palestinians in its own country. That Arab country, with the blessings of the rest of the Arab world, could simply have announced the Palestinians have their own state now in the West Bank. They didn't do it. And the Arab world didn't clamor for it. And I must say, my friend Jim is quite honest. And I asked him whether during that period he had ever asked that there be such a state, and he said no, he hadn't. That's the closest thing to admitting a difference or a mistake that I've heard. But that's a fact. 1967, difficult, terrible war forced upon Israel, in my judgment, but not Jim's. At the end of that, had there been negotiations resulting from 242, there could have been a Palestinian state created. So all these opportunities were missed. Now, because of this time period, it is more difficult, but not impossible, to do the full justice to the Palestinians. Autonomy was the beginning, and so I complete this statement by repeating the conclusion of my last statement, which is, how do we get the peace process moving? If you insist that there can be no forward movement unless the PLO sits there today and forgets the important role of Jordan, the important role of Egypt, the important role of the indigenous Palestinians, then it's a non-starter, and you're not really helping the Palestinians by that kind of insistence.
The problem with talking about 1948 for Mr. Bookbinder is that he cannot really. What he's trying to do is lay everything off on the Palestinians. It's their fault that they became victims. What happened in 1948 was this: the Palestinians were living in Palestine. In 1917, as many of you know, the Palestinians had been promised, along with the other Arabs, had been promised their independence by Great Britain if they would help Great Britain against Turkey in World War I. So the Arabs agreed. They created a revolt. Remember the Lawrence of Arabia business? They created a revolt. They revolted against the Turks, kept them busy, kept them out of the European theater of the war. And in their gratitude, Great Britain then gave a simultaneous promise of a Jewish home to the Zionist movement. They broke their promise to the Palestinians. And so what happened then in 1948, after a series of moves of immigration of Jews from around the world into Palestine, over the objection of the Palestinians, they saw what was coming. In 1947, the UN passed a non-binding partition resolution, which the Arabs did not like. Then in 1948, Israel amassed an army of some 60,000 troops, pretty well trained, against 5 armies. As he said, they were poised and ready to invade. 5 armies of Arab countries comprising 20,000 troops, some 20,000. A 3-to-1 advantage by the Jewish settlement at that point. And the Jewish settlement declared that Israel was a state, and they stood there with their guns, waiting. And in fact, there has been recent evidence that I have read in a book by Simcha Flapan, an Israeli peace activist who spent all of his life trying to get Israel to make peace with the Palestinians. He died in April of this year. But his book was published this year based upon documents that were released beginning in 1982 from the Israeli archives by none other than Menachem Begin, who was trying to prove to the Labor Party that they did the same thing in 48 that he did in 1982 in Lebanon. But in any event, under this new information, what we have learned is that Ben Gurion understood that the Jewish settlement could defeat the Arabs. And what we learned was the Arab leadership, with the exception of Haj Amin al-Husseini, only one of the Palestinian leaders, most of the leadership understood that they were going to lose the war. So they tried to create a modus vivendi. And Ben Gurion instructed his negotiators to reject any movements for peace, and in fact, he deliberately goaded the Arabs into a war, knowing he could defeat them at the time. And of course, that came true. As a matter of fact, what happened was he wanted much more than the partition plan would have allotted him, and he eventually got much more. He got all of Palestine.
We are now in the fiction part of the program.
Well, you see, he cannot, that one thing he can't do is he cannot refute this history.
We're going to, at the end of the session, we'll have 4 minutes for a summary of each position. And if it's acceptable to both of the debaters, we'll open the floor for questions. The floor will be open until 12 minutes after 7. The session will end at 7:20 promptly. Yes, sir, in the center.
We'll repeat the
The
question.
question will be repeated. Yeah.
You as an American, if the United States government law said your children will not go to certain schools, will not support the school which your children going to, you will not finance it. They go to school which your children went to because your children have gone out and threw stones at the soldiers.
I will be outraged.
You will be out.
Yeah, that's all right.
You say yes.
Yeah.
Have the United States government have the United States system? Is it a private system? When they discriminate against you as a minority, as a person who not be occupied.
The question is, if indeed your children's schools were closed because of actions they may have taken against the local police, would you consider that to be a democratic society? And of course, the analogy is to the circumstances on the West Bank.
I assume you're talking about the West Bank, not Israel, the original Israel. You're talking about the West Bank. Well, I thought I said maybe I used too few words, even though I'm long-winded. I may have used too few words at that point. I said before, war and the conditions that result from war are ugly things, and bad things happen. The West Bank is a very unhappy place for Palestinians and for the relatively few Jews who live there. It's a very, very unhappy place. Incidents happen. Hate is begetting hate. I try to say that in the book. I believe that most sincerely. I am very desperately hoping for a breakthrough. But it's only fair, sir, is it not fair, to remind you that in Israel proper, the original Israel, several 100,000 Arabs remained, even during the difficult War of Independence, did remain. They were given citizenship, the right to vote. There are Arabs who serve in the Knesset of Israel. Tell me, mention one other Middle East country where there's a counterpart to that, with Jews having that kind of rate of reception.
Syria. There are 2 Jews on the Syrian parliament.
In Syria, we are still struggling to get the remaining Jews out of Syria. Syria won't even let them emigrate.
They won't leave, Boogie. They won't leave. There are two Jews, Syrian Jews in the Syrian parliament, and 2 in the foreign ministry, I might tell you, who are in the United States section.
You might be able to check that. In good standing? Jews in good standing?
I guess they must be.
But you understand the basic point I'm making. Yeah.
Israel has kept all these legitimate mayors and representatives of the Palestinian people out of their position.
Yeah. No, we can exchange this thing tragically too long because we all have a lot of incidents to point to. But I want to remind you again, because if you're looking at history, the present, you got to balance things. 600 to 650,000 Jews in 1948 were driven out of a number of Arab countries. They had to find a new homeland, and this tiny fledgling state of Israel made room for them. People sacrificed. Did the Arab world try to do the same thing for the Palestinian refugees at that time? The answer is a resounding, horrible, tragic no. And that's why we still have the difficult problem today.
Well, I've got to respond to that.
Sure.
What you neglect to say in that whole argument is that the Palestinians themselves chose not to be assimilated. Because they believed if they did, they would lose their case in the court of world opinion. And the Arabs assimilated all they could. Their infrastructures could not handle too many, but the ones in the camps were surplus agricultural workers, and there was no place to put them in the Arab countries.
No,
you know that very well.
No, I do not know that. I absolutely disapprove of what you just said.
Mr. Sherman.
Gentlemen, as you sit here reviewing the past, in the present, for the first time in the sense of history that you've been talking about, the Arab world has found another enemy in Iran. And sections of the Arab world are accepting Egypt's position vis-a-vis Israel. Now, in the context of the world situation as it's changed in the Middle East because of Iran and the looking at Iran as an enemy, what would your statements be beyond the one that you made, Mr. Bookbinder, about the fact that Shamir is not willing to join correctly? What would your statements be about looking to the future of world peace, how you could both build your debates and the book you've written to take this moment in history and move on now to peace in the Middle East?
The question, I think, was directed first to you, Mr. Herman.
Well, I don't know whether the Baltimore papers had the same story that the New York Times paper had this morning about Abourezk. I associate myself completely with Abourezk. He said, in effect, what the questioner was asking us. He said, I hope that Israel doesn't miss what might be an important moment in history. And that we ought to try to understand and look as sympathetically and constructively as possible at the signals coming from that Amman conference. I have never had any hesitation in saying or writing, and I'm still considered in good standing in the Jewish community, even though I say this, if that's kind of community we have. Israel, too, can be faulted for missing opportunities in history. I have never claimed that Israel has a perfect record. For example, the woman that we all love and honor, Golda Meir, she made a mistake, a serious mistake. She was not ready to accept publicly or even privately, as far as I know, that there was such a thing as a Palestinian aspiration that had to be respected. She waited too long before she acknowledged that. That was a mistake. Well, let's try to avoid mistakes like that. If the Arab world is prepared to say, in effect, all right, we think you did the wrong thing 40 years ago, you mistreated our people, but okay, there's a new generation, 2 new generations of Israelis, we accept you, we don't have to love you, we accept you, now let's go ahead. If they want to send that signal, I hope that we don't miss it.
Well, just very briefly, I think the real point is that the Palestinians are ready to do that now, not ready to get up and give away everything before the negotiation. But I'm confident that in the context of a negotiation, there would be exchanges of territory, exchanges of recognition, exchanges of security guarantees, underwritten by the superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. And I don't know, very frankly, why Israel is holding out. I honestly don't know it, unless it is that they intend to annex the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. To me, there is no other reason for that. Now that the PLO itself has come forward after all these years of revolution, when they've switched now into a diplomatic sort of mode.
The PLO has not come forward. That's my point, Jim.
Well, Bookie, they have. I'm sorry.
Why don't you make an appeal to the PLO? Just like I made.
What do you want to do? Crawl on their hands and knees?
No, Jim, just look. Maybe this could be the most constructive debate we've had in all these weeks. I'm not joking when I say this. I have now made, I can't speak for others, but I at least have made a public statement that I call upon Israel not to miss an opportunity if there's a potential there. Why don't you match me with at least saying, you call upon the PLO to reconsider its stubbornness about doing these 2 eminently reasonable things? Why do you
call them eminently reasonable when you're asking them to give up something before the negotiation?
Give up what?
What? A recognition. That's all that Israel wants from them is recognition. Why do you ask them before the negotiation? I mean, that's big. It's easy. Look, look at the imbalance in power between the two sides. And isn't it not, I mean, if Muhammad Ali came to you and said, you got to do some grubbling before you and I can come to terms here, I mean, it's the very same thing. Why would you do that? It's something that the PLO has to give up in the negotiation, not before. Why do you make it conditional upon them and not upon the Israelis? I'm asking the question. Why do you make it conditional on one side and not on the other?
You have made truly eloquent appeals to me from time to time. You said, are you trying to understand the pain of the Palestinians? And I acknowledge that maybe sometimes I don't seem to be sympathetic enough. I'm asking you and everybody in this audience to try to understand the conditions under which Israeli mothers and fathers and children live day by day by day.
Well, then that's why they should sit down and talk peace.
That's why they worry about an involvement of PLO in a state right next to it, which is still pledged to its very destruction. Can't you understand that, Jim?
Can't you understand that the PLO does not have the ability to destroy Israel? And that if there were a peace negotiation, If there were a peace negotiation, there would obviously be security guarantees. Why do you make it sound that after a treaty it's going to be like before the treaty? What you trying to confuse people or what?
No, I think Israelis do not want to have present right next to them a country, a new state, run by an organization that says, and already has demonstrated, it knows how to put bombs in food markets, it knows how to lob bombs into Ma'alat and Kiryat Shimona. Israelis have memories, and they have pains of the children they lost.
You would rather keep the fight going, is that right? You want to keep it going instead of signing a peace agreement?
Well, isn't it at least as valid to say, why is the PLO so stubborn and permitting this thing to go on? Why isn't my state...
They are ready to sit down. How many times do I have to tell you? They're ready to sit down and talk. Why hold it up? Why object to it?
I think we're repeating ourselves.
Mr. Bookbinder,
Have that microphone.
if I may, I'd like to direct your interest to the future. We've heard a lot about the past, and it's been very grim on both sides. We've talked also about the desire of the Israelis to sit down and negotiate with the PLO under these conditions. What would be wrong with them sitting down with the PLO under a quid pro quo agreement that you recognize our right to exist and we'll recognize your right to exist? Because those Palestinians that have been disposed there have been living in that land for a millennium. And we recognize Israel's right to have the same respect of any other nation to integrity of her borders, but why can't she sit down with those people on a quid pro quo basis and talk with them? Our government, and this is my last point, our government wants to solve the problem in Nicaragua right now, and our president is trying to tell the leader of the House, let the South Americans or Central Americans handle it. Excuse me, we don't want to be directly involved in it. Why doesn't the Israelis and why don't our government also recognize that they could handle it themselves on a good pro quo?
Well, you really asked me the same question we've been discussing. It's essentially the same question, but you've got a new wrinkle in there. Interestingly enough, in the book, both of us were invited to put in chapters recommending readings and so on. The only book that both of us commended highly is a book by David Shipler called Arab and Jew. A marvelous book, despite his name, he's not Jewish, but very, very accurate, very fair. He gives help to both sides. He wrote in that book, one of the premises of your question goes to this. He wrote, the Palestinians did not recognize themselves as a people until the most recent instant of history, and mainly in response to the establishment and growth of the Jewish state. And he goes on to say that had the Arabs then not rejected a Palestinian state, Israel would have been smaller and they would have had their... Israel has to deal, I know it's late, I'm bringing in a new element now, we haven't got time to do justice to it, but Israel has to think of not only PLO and the problems with PLO. Israel is next to an important state called Jordan. Jordan has a very important stake in what happens in the West Bank. Jordan is not happy about the PLO. Sure, its leaders will every other time, they'll repeat the slogan about PLO, but in between, they'll also express horrors over having to deal with the PLO. PLO has been knocked out of Jordan at one point, it's been knocked out by Syria, it's been knocked out by Lebanon. Israel has a responsibility to think about the entire area and the relationships. So it isn't a simple matter. Jim Abourezk can keep repeating as often as he wants, just sit down with the PLO and the problem is solved. That's a simplistic version of a very complicated, multi-pronged problem that Israel faces, and the United States faces as a result.
Mr. Rich.
Mr. Bookbinder, I would like to accept your offer of being precise. I'm trying to attack this problem with some givens, something that everyone can more or less agree to. In the last several days, we've had people from the Near East here. And I was really encouraged and delighted to hear that the Arab League has stated that it's up to the individual Arab country if they choose to recognize the Israel. And so,
Egypt, not Israel. Egypt.
Pardon?
Egypt. It's up to them to decide about resuming relations with Egypt.
well, I must have misunderstood the speaker then. I was under the impression that because the way he worded it, he said, we don't care who recognizes Israel. And
no, the important is a semantic improvement in the language of the Arabic, by the way. You see words sometimes. Apparently, for the first time, the Arab League used the word Israel instead of the Zionist state. Used the word Israel. And it may sound naive. I consider that progress. I want to acknowledge that as progress.
well,
So,
now,
a tiny step towards recognition of Israel.
where do you leave me? Is that a given that this man gave us? That they will not be quarantined by the Arab League?
One thrust, I think, of Mr. Rich's question, beyond the specific issue of what the Arab League has said, is simply, are there givens upon which a prospect for peace indeed can be built?
Well, my next question, I wanted so you're leaving me in limbo. You're saying that...
Let's let that suffice as a question.
Okay. So we'll knock that off the given list. The next thing is, you use the term Zionist state. Would you kindly give me an explanation? Just what is Zionism? I've heard many uses.
That takes a long historical explanation. But perhaps we could just...
I'll be left in limbo too. So.
On that, I think. But on your original question of whether the two panelists could articulate what they think are the building blocks, perhaps that would be fair to ask. They decline at this point. Yes, sir. Next question.
Senator Abourezk, looking at a map, it's easy to understand why Israel would be concerned about the establishment on the West Bank, 9 miles away from the cutting Israel in two of a hostile state. And that's easy to understand. What I find hard to understand is this passionate call for the establishment of a Palestinian state, when you consider that from 1948 to 1967, 19 long years under Jordanian rule, while the Palestinians were using the gravestones of Jews as urinals, there was no cry for a Palestinian state that I can remember. The conscience of the world was not up in arms about the deprivation of the Palestinians from having their state. What is the difference, and why is this sudden acknowledgement by everybody that the Palestinians must have a state and that it not be a part of Jordan like it was then?
Well, what do you mean like it was then? It never was.
1948 to 1967.
Well, Jordan occupied the West Bank at that time, and they are the ones who did not create a Palestinian state, not the Palestinians. So if you're going to blame somebody, blame Jordan, but not the Palestinians. And the reason there always has been an outcry for a Palestinian state ever since 1917. I guess you must not have been reading the newspaper, though they weren't printed in the newspapers from that time on. But it didn't just start in 1967 or just last year. It's been going on for a long time.
But let me just add.
Well, why don't you let another guy ask a question? You don't have to answer every one of these.
We're going to have one more question, and then the panels will be given a chance to summarize.
No, I was not limited to that.
Last question.
Thank you. There's been some talk about negotiating with the Palestine Liberation Organization. Are we convinced, are we sure that they could bring the entire Palestinian community with them? I'm thinking in terms of 1983, when there was a war between Syria and Palestinians in northern Lebanon, Tripoli, and some of the newspaper reports in this country made it sound quite vicious. There's another instances of intra-Palestinian conflicts. I mean, even if PLO were to be part of the negotiating process, can we be sure that a treaty signed with them would be worth anything?
Well, yeah. Do you want me to answer that? There was an uprising in the PLO beginning in 1983 with the backing of Syria who backed, what happened was that President Assad was personally angry at Arafat over something he said to him in 1982. I happen to know what that was, but that was a sort of a feud that the two were carrying on. So Syria backed some dissident groups of Palestinians, Abu Musa, I think Habash broke off for a while and so on. But after all that bloodletting, and finally this year at the Palestine National Council meeting in Algiers, the PLO once again reunified. And in fact, the Fatah faction of the PLO is by far the largest faction. That's why Arafat keeps getting elected as chairman of the Executive Council, because he has the most votes. But what would happen was, even without Abu Musa, and even without Habash, the overwhelming majority of the PLO, the Palestinians in fact, agree with what the PLO does. They all consider themselves to be part of the PLO, although they don't have membership cards. But that is the organization that represents them. It's the one that speaks to their aspirations and their hopes for the future and defends them whenever they can. So that's why there's a lot of people fail to recognize the real strong connection, the linkage between the Palestinian diaspora, those under occupation, and the PLO. It's a very strong connection.
We'll have to make that the last question, and we'll have to limit the summaries to no more than 2 minutes, please.
Okay, 2 minutes. Let me try to then say this. I haven't used these words up to this point, but let me use them now. This is a story of two peoples, in my judgment, who've suffered badly over the decades. We got to recognize that. That's what makes it so difficult. I've never contended, and nobody should contend, that the Palestinians have no rights or have no problems. They've been ignored, mostly by their own fellow Arabs. That's my judgment, that's what I've said. Whatever the history was 30, 40 years ago, even if Schiffler is right that this is just an instant in history that there's a Palestinian aspiration, I acknowledge it, the world has to acknowledge it. But it also has to be remembered that there are two ways that any people become a state. There are two ways. Either you negotiate it or you fight for it. A lot of states are the result of wars and they become states. Others have become states because they convince their neighbors and the world, in effect, that it's right. The Palestinians have tried to do it through terrorism, through violence. They failed to do it that way. They have yet to have a successful negotiation. I hope they can have. If they do, if they persuade all of the states involved, not only Israel, that their needs can be satisfied only through their own state, if they can satisfy their neighbors, then let it be. I said I would be the first to cheer. That's the word I used in the book. But until that happens,